In today's episode of Today in World War II, March 14th, 450,000 Finns began to evacuate from territories that were ceded to the Soviets because of the Winter War Peace Treaty. The first deciphering machines become operational at Bletchley Park. A bad luck British sub is sunk for the second time in the war. And finally, Admiral Nimitz declares that Iwo Jima is secure. Although the Japanese have a different opinion about that. Let's get started. Okay, so on March 14th, 1940, we have the Finns and the Soviets sign the peace agreement to end the Winter War yesterday on the March 13th. On March 14th, today, on today's date, the first of over 450,000 Finnish civilians began to evacuate to Finland because they did not want to live under Soviet rule after this peace treaty. In fact, um, quite a few of them, the majority of them, burned their houses to the ground to leave as little useful things for the Soviets as possible. Um, there's no love lost between the Finns and the Russians. Let's put it that way, even now. So just keep that in mind. I was in Finland from 85 till 87. I spoke with a lot of Finns who had to evacuate, and the bitterness was still there. And this was in the 80s, so it was like 40 years later. Over 40 years later, they still were bitter about it, very bitter. And it was quite the feat for the Finns. It wasn't a rich country. They had to build new houses, provide housing for these refugees. 450,000 of them had to be given new homes, had to find new places for them. And it's interesting, even though Finland's a very small country, it's diverse. If you're from Karelia, their language was is different. Their dialect very different, as opposed to Western Finland or Northern Finland or Central Finland. Even though it's a small area, lots of diversity in culture, lots of diversity in accents. So there wasn't much homogenization as you see now in Finland. But back then, even in the 80s when I was there, I mean, you could tell just like that if someone was from Karelia or someone was from, let's say, Central Finland just by their accent and the words they use. So it was fascinating. So that was a Herculean task on their part to try to incorporate these new in-country refugees. I just thought that was very interesting. March 14th, 1940, the very first decipher machine became operational at Bletchley Park. If you remember, Bletchley Park was the center for Allied, in this case, British code breaking, although they did have lots of not Finns, Poles there. But this was before the invasion of Western Europe. The Poles had mostly gone to France and they were continuing their efforts to decode the German Enigma machines. Obviously, they'll end up in London, in Bletchley Park after the invasion. Anyway, the war behind the scenes continues. And as we know, you break the codes and you know what's going on, then that gives you such a huge advantage. And it can even help a lesser power win battles, as we'll see in a few months in this series when we talk about Midway, which we were able to set up a bear trap on the Japanese because we knew beforehand where they were going to attack. And that's so important. And it was crucial in the Battle of the Atlantic to be able to take out as many of these submarines as possible. On March 14th, 1943, this is another what I call a trivial pursuit mosaic puzzle piece of World War II that not many people know about, but I just find it fascinating, these stories that come out if you do a lot of research. And that's why I hope you enjoy my content. On March 14th, 1943, the British submarine HMS Thunderbolt was sunk off of Sicily by an Italian corvette, the Cigogna, and killed all on board. Now, with all due respect to the crew of the HMS Thunderbolt, if that had been the end of the story, I might not have included it in this video series because it's like, well, you can't talk about every single submarine that was sunk in the war. I wouldn't have enough. I mean, my videos would go 2 hours long every day. But what I find interesting about this is this submarine, the HMS Thunderbolt, the boat itself had actually sunk in 1939, before the war, it was doing its sea trials. Something happened. It took on water and it sunk and it killed the entire crew of 99 people. So the Royal Navy raised the sub, salvaged it, relaunched it, and gave it a new name, the HMS Thunderbolt. Sailors are very superstitious. And I wonder if any of them knew that they were crewing a submarine that had been sunk and all the crew had been killed before. So I don't know. Just it's interesting, like bad luck boat there. And then on March 14th, 1945, Admiral Nimitz declared that the island of Iwo Jima was conquered and secure. He said, quote unquote, all powers of government of the Japanese Empire in these islands are hereby suspended. Well, Chet, I don't think that memorandum got to the Japanese garrison there because they were still fighting. I think by this time they had pushed the Japanese to the extreme western part of the island. It was very more mountainous. That's where the majority of the defense was still at. They could still fire. They were still resisting, but the two airfields had been taken, and there were already B-29s landing on it that had damage from their raids over Japan that they would have been lost at sea if Iwo Jima had not been uh, conquered enough to at least to get the airfields running. So that was the main reason why Iwo Jima was taken because they wanted the airfields as an emergency landing place for the B-29s and for them to base the P-51 Mustangs. They didn't have the range to go from the Marianas and back, but they could easily go from Iwo Jima and back to escort the B-29s. So that's what happened on today, March 14th in World War II. And I thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you tomorrow.